Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Rise Above TV, where we are empowering humanity and supporting unity. You're watching Good Grief, where we're meeting loss with presence, one wave at a time. Hosted by Janie Terrazas, the Mindfulness Coach, and Kelvin, an internationally recognized author, meditation expert, and grief and death guide with over 50 years of experience, helping people navigate life's most profound questions. He is the founder and executive director of the Overcoming the Fear of Death Foundation, the Turning Within Meditation Foundation, and kelvinchin.org, nonprofit platforms dedicated to reducing fear, deepening inner peace, and empowering individuals to live more fully in the present moment. Kelvin, I'm super pumped to finally be sitting here with you. I wish we were in person, to be honest with you, because it's just been way too long since we've hung out. We've been talking about wanting to do a series on grief. I feel like it's a misunderstood experience and funny enough, it's one thing that unites all of us as a human race is grief. There's loss when somebody dies and it's an unexpected death or an expected death. It hurts, right? When you lose a loved one, a pet, a relationship comes to an end, a job loss, like if you get fired or you end up quitting, like even retirement can do something to your identity, which is another part of the death process when you go through transformation. And to be able to get your insight and what you've learned, even when it comes to like the 5 stages of grief and like the myths around grief and your personal story with how you even came to have a relationship with it and why a good chunk of your work and what you've dedicated your life to is specifically around this field. So there's lots to cover. I feel like maybe the best place to start really is how would you personally define grief? And, what's the scientific definition if there is one?
Sure. So, as you know, Janie, because we've had offline conversations and in our personal relationship and so forth for years, you know that I've been helping people with grief and death and dying issues for many, many decades now. And the way I look at grief is uh, twofold. Obviously, most people think when they think of grief, they think of sadness and they think of very overwhelming sadness, like being consumed by the sadness of whatever the loss is. And as you mentioned briefly, most people are thinking about loss in terms of death of a loved one, which is true, which is a tremendous loss. Um, but there's all kinds of other losses and sources of grief like losing a job, losing money, moving across country, losing friends, and so forth in that process. There's a lot of other forms of loss and sources of grief besides just losing a loved one to death. But the big one for most
Mhm.
people tends to be the loss of a loved one through death, which is understandable. Um, and sadness is usually what most people associate grief with, which is also understandable, makes sense. We've all experienced that. But the way I look at grief, that's just part of grief and grieving. I think there's this other part of grief and grieving that is often overlooked. And I think of it more in terms of a loss of familiarity of behavior or patterns in life that we become used to, and we lose those patterns or those familiarity of being with that person. If it's a loss of a loved one and who's died, then they're no longer physically, biologically here with us anymore. So obviously, that's a huge loss of familiarity and behavior, and they're not in our lives anymore. Um, and yes, there's a sadness that is associated with that, but I think looking at also as a loss of familiarity of a pattern of behavior and so forth um, is very useful in terms of the recovery of process, in terms of recovering ourselves so that we can move forward with our lives eventually, because that's really what we all would like to do, you know, not be as overwhelmed and consumed by the grief. I tell people, look, we never get over the loss of whatever it is that we have lost, especially if it's the loss of a deeply loved loved one, well, you're never going to forget it. In other words, we never get over it in terms of forgetting about them because we've lost them. But can we move forward in a way with the loss? Yes, we have been changed by that loss, of course, but can we move forward? And I think that's what I refer to as recovery from the grief and so forth. Never forgetting, we never forget, but we can move forward in a more productive way with our life. More productive meaning what? Meaning not being so consumed and overwhelmed by the sadness anymore.
Right. It's like the brain and the mind body needs time to acclimate with a new reality. And anytime it's experiencing that significant of, we'll say, difference, right? Where it's a lot of pieces in your day are different because this is a person maybe that was around you a lot.
Right.
It almost feels like an amputation. How do you help a person come to terms with that loss? And I love that you're helping people acknowledge and understand, right? Understand and understand, overstand all the parts that are going to come along with it. Because then, even though it doesn't necessarily take all of the discomfort away, there's a level of helplessness and hopelessness and fear that you're able to relieve. And over time, like that relief becomes bigger, it grows,
Yeah.
the resilience grows, but the memory is still kept of the person.
The memory is still there and the feelings are still there, but the overwhelm part
Right.
reduces and the fears and the consumption by the loss can reduce over time. And the thing is, it's,
Yeah.
um, and there's no straight line about any of this. It's a curvy line. There's no right way, there's no wrong way to grieve. It's really important to allow ourselves to grieve and process and feel our emotions in whatever way that they're appearing, and to not try to control it and not try to judge ourselves or judge others who may be grieving. If we're the griever,
Mhm.
we're the caregiver of somebody else who's grieving, it's very important not to judge and not to, you know, not to
Rush,
try
like
to,
rush them or,
you can't rush and you can't package this. It's a very fluid situation when we're talking about grieving, we're talking about emotions, we're talking about things that don't always make sense, that you can't always make sense of
yeah.
why am I walking down the street and I'm having a nice conversation with somebody about whatever, and all of a sudden this wave of sadness comes over me. We call them grief bursts.
Mm-hmm.
You have this burst of grief
Yeah.
out of nowhere, and it doesn't make any sense. It's okay. It's okay. You know?
Yes. And I think you are helping people learn to be okay with the feelings of not feeling okay, you
Right.
know? And that in itself is it relieves the stress of it, right? Like the overwhelm, like you were saying. We'll go into like your relationship with grief, right? Because
Mm.
you've had lots of time to, one, through your personal experiences, understand it and learn how to talk about it the way you do now and be with it the way you do. But then you also have been able to then share that experience and all the knowledge and wisdom that you've acquired over the years through meditation, through direct experience with your own connection to source, as well as what you've studied. And
Yeah.
then all the people, just being around people, right? Your clients, it's like you start to see patterns. And it's from that your body of work enriches. You got all kinds of really cool ways to be with, like you said, the sadness. And we can touch on that in a little bit, but maybe first start off with like your first experience with grief and how that came to be.
Yeah. So my first experience that really touched me so deeply was the death of my mom. My mother died when she was young. She was only in 50 years old and was on the outside the picture of health, and energy and vibrancy and creativity and all the good stuff. And I was very close to my mom. And but then she died so quickly because she had advanced stage 4 cancer, and thousands of tumors in her body were discovered on her first visit to get scanned. So it's highly unusual that you have thousands of tumors and so asymptomatic prior to that, but she was. And as a result, she died very quickly. Um, and it was very difficult for all of us in the family to adjust to on such a short period of time. It's almost like it's not exactly like somebody getting hit by a car, and you don't see them again for the rest of your life. You don't see them. But it was similar to that because just in a matter of short few months, my mom was dead. Biologically moved on to the other side, as they say. Um, at that point in my life, I'd already been meditating for 12 years. I learned to meditate when I was a teenager just because I was stressed out. I did not learn for spiritual reasons. I've had all kinds of spiritual experiences since then, but that's not why I get into meditation. I get into meditation because I was very highly anxious. So by the time my mom died, I'd already been meditating 12 years. And I say that because I'm still a human being with emotions and a deep love and connection with my mother, who just died suddenly, out of the blue, basically, it seemingly. And so, notwithstanding the fact that I'd been meditating for 12 years and I'd already taught 1,000 people to meditate by the time my mom died, I'm still consumed by this grief and this sadness of my mom's sudden exit, really, from my life. That was the first thing. I mean, that really blew me away emotionally and psychically, energetically, and even intellectually, thinking about death. I really got me to think about death much more from even an intellectual standpoint. But emotionally, I was really swept away by the grief when my mom died. Now, I'd had other people die in my life before that, my grandparents, so forth. But they're 80, 90 years old, and they lived their whole life. And my mom was in the middle of her life, as far as I was concerned, and she died. So that was the first time, the first event that really shook me. And I started talking to people about it. To answer your second part of your question, Janie, I started talking to people about it just really by accident. I was in law school at the time, and I started talking to people about the fact that my mom died. And it was just, people say, "Hey, how you doing?" And I say, "Well, I'm okay," which I wasn't. I wasn't okay. But you know how you don't want to get into it sometimes. So you just say, "Oh, I'm okay, but my mom just died." And boom, they just opened them up. That self-disclosure on my part opened them up to start telling me, "Oh, my grandfather just died. I was so close to him. He raised me, blah, blah, blah." Or, my brother just died in a motorcycle accident, or whatever. Just things started, you know, coming out of people just in conversation. And then I started helping people because I noticed that it started helping me. So those conversations, grief conversations with others, I noticed it helped me. So that's how I started learning about what worked. Much later, like 10 years ago, I've taken grief seminars and I've gotten certified in grief counseling and grief recovery and so forth. But back then it was just learning on the street, literally, just through conversation, trial and error, what worked.
Most of your learning and growth and your ability to help others has been through the visceral experience itself
Yeah,
because you can intellectually know something, but until it's embodied and
yeah,
really understood, that's when I feel like knowledge can turn into wisdom. Now we have a good sense of like your first experience with this and how deep your relationship with was with your mom. Are there any little moments? I'm sure you had some just and this is more like kind of a side note, spiritual experiences with your mother, like after she's crossed over, where she's come to you in dreams or anything like that?
Sure. Yeah, I've had a number of communications with my mom, especially um, after she died, within several years after she died. And my experience with my parents is that I had more communication with them soon after they died than later. They're off doing their other things in the afterlife. And
Yeah.
other people have had more recent communications with both of my parents separately than I have. So they kind of know that I'm fine. And then I hear about them through my daughter. Sometimes my clients have been communicated with by my parents, which is kind of crazy. Yeah. And then my clients will tell me, oh, your dad visited me. I'm like, what? And they'll tell me these experiences that they've
What?
had. Yeah. And telling me stuff.
That's so cool. I love it. And I feel like when our loved ones come through in dreams like that, it's really common. I'm starting to find that it's common because I've had some experiences like that myself too. And you hear these stories like this story where they will purposely give some piece of information that this person that's sharing this dream with like couldn't really possibly know.
Exactly.
Right? And
Yeah,
so it's like, how do you make sense of that? And that's another thing, kind of going back to grief and the non-linearness and like the openness to having a deeper understanding to the afterlife. And I mean, I don't know if now is a good time for this segment for us to get into it because that's like a piece in itself, right? Like, what is death
sure.
really?
Right.
But going back to your experience and your evolution and your process with it, um, what would you say is one of the tools, something that tends to be I don't want to say simple, but like a pretty good go-to when someone's first starting and kind of come into this space with
The
grief?
main thing with grief bursts and so forth is first of all, as I already said, the main thing is not to judge ourselves for having it. It's going to happen, and they're going to happen out of the blue, and they're going to happen at different times. They're going to happen at inopportune times. In other words, sometimes they're going to happen at what we may consider, oh, really? This is happening now? I'm
Right?
at my
I'm
nephew's birthday party, and now I'm having a grief burst. You know, this is
Yes,
supposed to be a
exactly.
happy event and so forth, and
Yes.
all the relatives are here, and now I feel like, no, you need to acknowledge what you're going through and
Hmm.
just politely, in that case, let's use that as an example,
Hmm.
step aside, go to a different room, maybe even just go to the bathroom. I mean, nobody's going to question you going to the bathroom.
Sure.
Go into the bathroom and close the door, and you cry, and you have an emotional moment with
Release.
yourself for a while, and it's a
Exactly.
release. And we're walking around when we have grief like a pressure cooker, like a tea kettle, and we need to let the steam out sometimes. We don't want a tea kettle that has a top with no hole in it. You know, you want a hole in the top. And that's as an example. You're at your nephew's, you know, sixth birthday party or fifth, second birthday party or whatever, and everybody's so happy. He's and you have a grief burst. Well, you step aside and you have your grief burst. You don't stuff it. That's the main thing. You don't
Yeah.
stuff it. You don't try to put a smile on your face just because you're at your nephew's birthday party. No, you step aside and you acknowledge yourself. You
Hmm.
need to acknowledge yourself in your relationship with yourself. Otherwise, we drive it deeper. We drive the tension, the emotional pain, we drive the trauma deeper into us. And that's the worst thing to do. So, it'll happen at various times. The other thing that I suggest is if we're alone, let's take the other extreme, is
Okay.
if we're alone and it happens, and we're sitting reading a book and we're enjoying the book or whatever, or sitting watching a Netflix movie and we're enjoying it, and all of a sudden something triggers who knows what, and it's maybe the movie, it's maybe the book, but maybe it's not the movie and not the book. It just comes over us, and we have a moment of sadness and grief, a grief burst, then what I suggest in that situation is, first of all, again, don't resist it. But if it becomes so uncomfortable, then one can get up, do something different. Don't try to force yourself to continue reading the book or watching the movie or whatever. Take a break and just be in the emotion that you're in at the time, if you're alone, in other words.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you know,
Movement's great. Like I like that idea. Just like even just getting up and just moving your body, something as simple as that. It's
movement.
it's it's just yes, because if there's again going back to the wave, right? If there's a wave of emotion and then you try to just be still, it's in that rigidity. It's kind of like even just jumping up and down, and there's like all these cool little qigong like tools
Yeah.
and stuff that
And
you can do.
why does that work? That works if you think about it. It's very biological, scientific, and
Mhm.
logical why movement works. When you're starting to feel very emotional, what most people forget is that it's not purely a mental experience, it's also a physical experience. There's biochemistry involved, and there's cortisol, and there's adrenaline, there's a lot of different hormones and chemicals. And there's 40 to 60 hormones and chemicals, depending on which endocrinologist you talk to, that's going on, that's shifting and moving around. Well, the best thing to do, if it's very strong, the emotional reaction is very strong, is, as Janie said, you get up and you move around. What does that do? That increases your heart rate just a little bit. That increase of the heart rate does what? It pumps more blood to the cells throughout the body, the brain, throughout the body, everything. What does that do? It brings more oxygen and nutrients to the cells, and it takes away the waste products faster to the liver and the kidneys, which are the filtration organs of our system. Well, when
Yes.
feeling really emotionally um, upset about something, then what is causing that? There's a physiological component in our biochemistry that causes that. We need to take away the waste products faster by moving. That helps move that process through us.
Yes, like when I found out we had neuropeptides in our body and they're reading emotional data and then speaking like all the systems and the cells, and it's just so fascinating when you really study physiology and the interfacing of the psychology and the physiology. It's like, and also too, just to kind of touch on this, we as a in terms of a human race, we haven't been well educated with emotional intelligence, which I think is one of the reasons why with grief, there's a lot of emotions that come up with it. So anger and sadness are emotions. And so when we see another person going through grief, we're like, oh, we get all weirded out. We get weirded out with our own emotional sensations and stuff like that. The reason why we struggle with grief is really because we struggle with emotions and we struggle with what our body feels when we have those emotions and we don't like it. And what you're teaching and what I'm like a big advocate for is, because as a mindfulness coach, it's like, how do we be mindful in a way where, like you mentioned earlier, giving ourselves the space and the grace to feel whatever comes up at any given moment. And I think another thing, going back to like what you were saying in social situations, we tend to want to hide like our feelings and just try to always put on a happy face, but we need to be okay with sometimes we're sad, sometimes we're angry, and we want to try to like, well, let's put a smile on that face. And it's like, no, if you try to take the frown away, then they'll end up drowning in it even more. But we don't understand that, right? That's why I love us talking about this and just creating this opportunity to have this dialogue. So anyway, I don't know what you want to touch on now
Yeah,
that I said all that.
the anger and frustration issue is a real thing. And that goes right to what I originally talked about, that the the there are conflicting feelings about any relationship. So when we're talking about grief, we're talking about the sadness, the overwhelming sadness typically, and we can reduce that overwhelming part of the sadness. The sadness never goes away. But there are conflicting feelings that are associated with the loss of this familiar pattern of behavior. And there are conflicting feelings that come along with the loss of any relationship, even the relationships where people, um, have a great relationship with the loved one. It's never perfect, but people will tend to remember all the good stuff and forget about the bad stuff. And yet the bad stuff, the conflicting feelings stuff it's causing those conflicting feelings inside if we're not really acknowledging the fullness and completeness of the relationship, which may include the warts as well as the joyful moments as well. And that processing of that full range of the relationship that we no longer have because they've died and they've moved on and they're now dead and biologically dead anyway,
Mm-hmm.
not in our lives, in a physical form here anymore. That loss is also sometimes colored, we'll say, by
Mm-hmm.
conflicting feelings. And that can cause anger, resentment, frustration if we don't acknowledge them.
Yes, it's almost like the shame. There's also shame around it too. And when I started learning about the emotional frequency chart, that all emotions, have a certain charge to them, and some are generative and some are degenerative. And it doesn't mean we're trying to label the degenerative as we should never feel them. It's just that we tend to not realize how much of that can create inflammation. And so when we're going through grief, our sleep patterns, our sleep is impacted, our eating habits sometimes are impacted. Like all these things are being affected, which then can also create even more stress. And when we're going through grief and we're in a state of contraction, to be able to do some practices and things to go into like giving yourself the room and the space to be more expansive with it
Yeah,
also helps with our energy levels too,
yeah.
because it's almost like taking a lot of hits when it's happening, and we have to nurture ourselves. We're already not very good at nurturing ourselves on a daily basis in a healthy way. So if that's already there, and then you deal with grief. Oh my God, now forget about like even that's not even in your thought system.
So that's that. So what you just reminded me of is how I describe the meditation process that I teach called turning within meditation. Um, it's different from other meditation processes. So I came up with this analogy to illustrate how different it is. And it's like our minds are like a deck on a big, huge ocean liner, big ship. And you got this big deck, and you got 100 or 200 deck chairs on the ship deck. The ship deck is our mind. The deck chairs are like our thoughts and emotions and feelings. And in this case, it could be some of the deck chairs are grief deck chair. They're representing grief, and they're representing other things too. The deck chairs, thoughts about our family, our the surviving family, and whatever members, our job, or whatever. Those are the deck chairs, thoughts and emotions and so forth, experiences. Most approaches to self-development and to grieving are dealing with the deck chairs. Oh, rearrange the deck chairs, rearrange how you're thinking about the loss of that loved one. And that can be helpful. And that is part of what I do when I work with people who are grieving. But the missing part that most people don't deal with is the expanding of the deck. And so when I teach meditation, it expands the size of the deck, which is expansion, what you just said, Janie, expanding the consciousness, expanding the capacity of our mind. And when we expand the capacity of our mind, we can move around and deal with the deck chairs a little bit more easily. In fact, we can get rid of some of the broken deck chairs, the broken patterns, thought patterns and emotional patterns that don't serve us anymore much more easily when the mind is more free and big because it's bigger. We're waking up more of our conscious capacity. That's the way I teach meditation. That's the result of it. It's not about focusing the mind. It's not about clearing the mind of the deck chairs. No, 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 no. The deck chairs are going to be there. That's not the approach that I take. Many meditation techniques are about trying to clear the mind. They're trying to get rid of the deck chairs. No, that's an impossibility. Deck chairs
Yeah.
are always going to be there. How can
Yes.
we expand the capacity without focus, without clearing the mind? That's the way, as you know, that's the way I teach it.
And that's how we met because we both know Scott Goyette of Go Love Now, and he had hired you to come teach our leadership team for Go Love Now your style of meditation. It was really powerful, and I really liked that's that difference, that spin on it. And it's been like very, very useful. And that's the methodology I like to use too, because going back to memory, the cells, about 50 trillion cells, are storing every breath we've ever taken, every memory, even just like in the womb, right? It's recording the experience of our mother and all of these things. And so what you're saying is in essence, since the chairs and all those things are there, we can't erase memories. It's about reframing, expanding, reframing, and seeing them in a new way and being with them in a new way. And over time, as you flex these muscles and you practice these things, right? Whether it's with triggers or whether it's a grief, what do you call it? Like a grief bomb or a little thing that just kind of hits you out of nowhere?
A grief burst, yeah.
Grief burst, there you go. Um, that it in that practice, it helps you be with those things. But just like with anything, you're not just going to be awesome at it right away, right? There's different pieces and parts that you come to terms with, I guess you could say, that then frees you into that more expansive space.
When
Open your
is with the meditation as I teach it, it's automatically expanding our conscious capacity. So when it automatically expands our conscious capacity, what does that do? That starts to free us up from the feeling of being overwhelmed by whatever
yeah.
the thought or the emotion is, whether it's grief or whether it's a thought about, oh, I got a flat tire on the 405 freeway or whatever. That does not consume us emotionally and mentally anymore when our mind is so much more expanded. The capacity is expanded. So my approach with dealing with grief is that twofold. So we expand our conscious capacity and we talk about processing the thought processes and the emotions and so forth.
Thank you. It's like the practical tools for the brain and the body or the mind, but you're also working with the other side of self. It's like, not to go too much into it, but the thing that's powering up our heart, the electricity that's coursing through the body, right? Law of thermodynamics says energy cannot be created or destroyed. You're saying, let's tap into that. And from that space, you're teaching people how to be an observer and a witnesser, right? A witness or notice these things with just enough space so that you can be with it and not like completely detach, but also not get like pulled under. How can you be with both sides at the same time?
Right.
Right? Does that,
Yeah, it's coexistence is what you're saying.
yeah,
It's and it's
yeah.
it's the identification issue. The phrase I use is identify.
Mhm.
Who am I? Am I the experiencer of my experiences that I'm having, whether they be grief experiences or watching a Netflix movie, whatever the experience is? I am not the experiences that I'm having. Most people are walking around and they think their mind is their thoughts. They think their thoughts and their mind are the same thing. That's wrong. That's incorrect. Your thoughts
Yeah.
are the expression of your mind. Your mind is the experiencer of the experiences it's having. There's something,
Right. It's the filters. It's all the filters that it's got to go through based on your persona and your set of belief structures and everything you've ever like recorded. It's going through there. And so people are just thinking that that's what I am, is the thought that's coming to me.
is the objects of what I call the objects of experience. No, we are not the objects of our experience. We are not our job. When we lose our job, some people lose themselves in the fact that they've lost their job. Really? Okay, I get it. I've lost my job. I don't have to worry about it now because I'm doing my nonprofit work full time. But back when I was raising a family, I lost my job 5 times after I was 50 years old. And I was like, really? Every couple of years, a company was being bought and sold, and I'm on the street again. Really? Through no fault of my own, I'm looking for a new job. That's a huge loss. I'm not denigrating that. It's huge.
Right.
In
It's
there.
massive.
Massive.
Yes.
But am I that? No, I am something separate from that experience. And therefore, because I had that awareness and that experience of myself as being strong and confident and separate from the fact that I had lost my job, I could go into an interview and get a new one and be
Yes.
confident and so forth. So
Yes.
yes, we
That's
have
like identity stuff. That's why this work also ties to the identity.
it's totally identity. It's
Mhm.
it's people tend to identify with the external as opposed to the internal.
Yes. And that's what I love about the work that you're doing because people might be coming to you for grief and they don't even realize they're about to go through an alchemical process with their own self. They're about to build a new relationship with their own self. So, all this work around grief is actually helping them have better connections and relationships and be able to appreciate and be more present and be able to see how they could put meaning on things in the way they'd like to. And a lot of times how we deal with grief is the way our families and the world around us has conditioned us to look and feel about it. And a big chunk of fear is all wrapped up in it in a lot of different ways. And it's funny that you say too, going back to just like as we're talking about identity, um, if somebody is a caretaker to somebody and
Right?
a big part, especially if it's been like 10 years or whatever, and that's where they're getting their worth and their value and their purposefulness,
Yes.
and then that gets cut off, they'll go into like,
Who am I?
yes. And
Who
I
am
think all of us are going to experience that at some point in our lives, better to do it with intention and purpose, like, you know what I mean, with knowing, as opposed to something just coming and putting you into that space.
I've seen that and helped people through that caregiver being cut off, their role as a caregiver being cut off by the death of their loved one. Again, like you say, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 10 years, and they're in that role, and there's all of a sudden a vacuum.
Oh,
It's a vacuum in their life because they have put, as you say, so much value, their own self-value, appropriately to a great degree, in taking care of their loved one. But then who are they? They go through an identity crisis of who am I now? I don't have that to do every day. And I was on 24/7 call, basically on call for 24/7 at the end and so forth. And now they have this space to do what? So when I work with them and I teach them to meditate, that it doesn't make that experience the vacuum go away that we're talking about, but it lessens the impact, the negative impact of it, because their identity is not 100% swept up in being a caregiver.
yep.
It's 50%, maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 80%, whatever. We can't measure that, but at least there's part of their identity. They're reminded every day by doing this simple meditation technique, 10 to 15 minutes each time, twice a day, that there's something else within that is not who they are externally.
Exactly.
That helps save them from that extra pain and suffering that inevitably is going to come with the loss of the loved one.
Yes. And what you just described too, some people may see the PazMesa sign here and that means peace within. There is order within the chaos. In what feels like suffering, there's a part of you that is completely whole and well, stable
Mhm.
and not afraid. And you're saying 10, 15 minutes a day of like the type of meditation that you do and finding a way to express it so it doesn't stay contained, because then that's when, like you were saying too, it creates even more toxicity and more of the feelings and neurobiochemistry of overwhelm. So if
Yep.
we can like move through it and be with it, we'll be better off. We were talking about caretakers right now and like all that thing. And it was getting me thinking about how I learned about the 5 stages of grief or death or loss while I was working at hospice. They gave me this big old book and they were like, and by the way, I was volunteering here. I did it for about a year and a half. Anyway, I was going through it, and that was when I was going through my divorce. And I was like, wait a second, 5 stages of grief, like this, I'm feeling all of these things too. But I also know that the framework around it and the understanding, or what we thought to be true about the 5 stages of grief, um, there's some new ways for us to look at them.
Yeah, let's talk about this. This is important because one of the biggest myths, there are a whole bunch of myths about grief, which we can get into, but let's talk about the first big myth is that there are 5 stages of grief. That is a myth. That is a mistake. It's a misinterpretation that many people, and in the fact that hospices are still promoting this is sad to me because it's not correct.
Right. And I learned this was back in 2016 and
Yeah,
2017. And of course, I've learned so
yeah,
much more since then.
that's pretty recent, though. It's still
Yeah.
pretty recent that they're still promoting this incorrect
Oh,
information. And
yes.
I have recently talked to some clients of mine and so forth who are psychotherapists, and the psychotherapy schools are pretty much starting to change that. And so they're not teaching 5 stages of grief anymore, which was incorrect. So just for people who are wondering, like, wait a minute, I've always heard that there were 5 stages of grief. What is he talking about?
Right.
Well, the source of them, this mistaken understanding, comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying from 1969. And it was a seminal book in the area of death and dying to talk more about death and dying in a more natural way, in not in a way that embraced the idea of death and talked about it in a very um, loving way, in a very inclusive way, not in a way that most people are, like, oh, death, go talk about that someplace else.
Yeah, yeah.
People would talk about her book in 1969. It was a seminal book in the area of death and dying. That said, she called them the 5 stages of dying, not the 5 stages of grief. Big difference. Okay,
Big difference.
difference. And the other thing that, oh, and you can go, and I suggest that anybody who's watching this go look up the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's Elizabeth with an S.
Hmm.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation website, and you'll see it. You look up 5 stages of grief on there in the search window. There's a whole page that describes how she did not describe them as grief, as stages of grief. They're stages of dying. And it was based on what? She went to a hospital and interviewed terminally ill patients.
Hmm.
Patients. They were dying.
Yeah, literally like dying.
Dying. They were not people who are grieving, like many of you who are watching this, of loss of a loved one. They were grieving their own loss of their own life and the surprise of hearing that they were going to die.
The
So
shock of it. Yes.
the shock that comes along with that, and the anger and the bargaining and all of that, makes sense if you think about it as a terminally ill patient who's suddenly told by the medical profession that you are going to die within 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or a year. Then the 5 stages kind of make sense. It's
Right.
appropriate always in grief situations. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. That's the
Hmm.
thing. And so, you know, it needs to be understood in the proper framework. And to me, it's just a very confusing thing for many of my clients because they've heard about the 5 stages of grief and not understood they were really just 5 stages of terminally ill, dying patients in a
Right.
hospital. The other thing that's misunderstood is that the the actual study was not, it wasn't a study per se that had a control group or anything like that. It wasn't a
Mhm.
scientific study, in other words, and it says that on the foundation website. It was not a research study that was done with any, special procedures or anything. It
Right.
was just an interview questionnaire that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did with these terminally ill hospital patients. That's all
Right.
it was. Tell me how you're feeling about what you just heard, so
Mhm.
forth and so on, about your illness, etc., and about how long they told you to live. It was questionnaire like. So don't be surprised, I say to my clients and to everybody who's listening here, that don't be surprised if you don't go through all of those 5 stages. And they certainly don't go through them in the order, it's
Yeah, not always, no. Yeah, like before you were saying, in general, like grief is not linear and it's not even something to get over. It's something to just, you start to understand it in a new way. And hopefully
yeah,
over time, you build a new relationship with it. And it
yeah,
just eases up over time, but it doesn't
yeah,
completely like, oh, you're going to get over it. And when people hear stages, they hear steps, and then they're hopefully like, oh, when that stage is done, then it's done, done.
right.
And I will say this, even though it makes way more sense to the dying part, like you said, now seeing where it was actually originating from and how we turned it into this whole other thing and just kind of put it across the board with loss and kind of confused the public. When I was in hospice and I was going looking at them in a funky way, like I think one of them is like denial and bargaining, like the first two or whatever.
Right.
And when I realized my marriage was pretty much coming to an end, but there was a part of me that was in denial. Like I didn't want to accept that. And then of course after the split and everything, the anger and the sadness, definitely I could see myself going to those places. And even now I can, the waves that still, like you were saying, like sometimes I'll watch a movie or I'll hear a song, and even though I have all the understanding and everything, I can still feel a little bit of that, oh,
Yeah.
where it's like, you know what?
Yeah.
Why do I still want to throw the finger at this guy? Like I I thought I was like above that. Like what
Yeah,
is that,
no.
And then
Yeah,
you start to build, I don't want to get into this, but like a spiritual ego. It's
yeah,
like you
yeah,
should
yeah.
know better and it's already been. And that's why we just had to be just real chill and real understanding. So I wanted to say I can see how the words of the 5 stages can come into play, but I do like that you were able to clear that up and sort of give us a more whole picture and say, hey, don't feel like you have to experience all of them.
Yes.
Like there's
Yes.
nothing wrong with you if
Yes.
you just something happens and you just really feel like okay with it all. That's great.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not that those so-called stages of grief are useless. They can be helpful to understand, but it's important to understand that they're not stages that you go through in any step-by-step fashion, as you just said,
Yeah.
Janie. And and,
Yes.
and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross actually in her second or third book actually specifically talked about how she felt sad that people had made her first book into these 5 stages of grief. That was not her intention. The author of it spoke about it in her second or third book about how she thought, no, don't do this. And yet people have done it because people, they want to pigeonhole this.
Yeah, they do. And we, as humans, like even like I think I said it, but when we hear stages, we hear steps. And so much of us are like, what are the steps? What are the steps I
Exactly.
need to do? And then, okay, so
Exactly.
then the steps are done. And then, okay, then I'm done, right? And then I'm good. And it's like we're so used to quick fixes,
Yeah.
going back to emotional intelligence. We don't really want to feel these things. So it's like, what do I need to do? What are the steps?
Right.
Let me try to force myself through them. And if you do that, forget about it. It's
Yeah.
like thinking that you can control a tornado, a hurricane, a
Yeah.
tsunami, earthquake. Like Mother Nature's gonna do its thing.
No, it's like it if anybody honestly, candidly looks at the relationship of the loved one that they lost, they'll know that it was not linear straight line. There was no step-by-step instruction book that came with that relationship. And so
No,
that's why would we expect that after the relationship is severed biologically, that our emotions in any way, shape, or form would continue in a step-by-step logical, linear fashion in our grieving process. It makes no sense. No,
no.
we need to be more, and to use your word that you use a lot, Janie, is just to be present. The presence and being present, having the presence to be present in the moment, whatever it is, and non-judgmental about ourselves is really where the rubber meets the road. And not trying to push ourselves this way or that way, especially for those who are very, we'll call it, at the fresh out of
Mm,
the loss. Like
hmm.
fresh meaning soon. And
Yeah.
what is soon? So here's, because I've worked with so many hundreds of people and groups of people over the years, people think, oh, but it's been a year. A year? No way. A year is nothing. Oh, but it's been 2 years and 3 years. There is no specific timeline on any of this. My mom
No.
has been passed away for now 40 something years. It's like, if people see me publicly speak about my mom in front of up 200 people, I'll be speaking and I'll get choked up.
Yeah, still, right? Because it's there, because the love for her is still
Yeah,
there. Yeah,
yeah.
within the
It's
body.
but I'm not overwhelmed. I'm not consumed by the grief. And that's
Right.
why I say it's so important not to define grief only by sadness. Because if you define it only by sadness, then you're going to think, well, I'm always sad. I'm always going to be overwhelmed by this grief. No, no, you can have the sadness and not lose your identity in the experience.
Right.
That's
It's like
possible.
we can remain grounded and centered into like what you were saying, that bigger consciousness,
Yes.
while allowing the identity and the temporal self, the mind, the body, the brain, to feel that wave that comes, or whatever the experience is. There's still so much more to like unpack and touch on, but I'd love to give the people a call to action. And I feel like earlier you were giving them an idea of like, hey, if you're in a social situation, or if you're, even if you're by yourself, but as you were speaking on this,
Mm.
mindfulness in a nutshell, right, is like paying attention on purpose in the now, non-judgmentally. There's this really cool acronym called SNAP, stop and take a breath. And I usually tell people like in through the nose and out through the mouth. And notice, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? And what is your body experiencing? Like notice and name. Then there's A, accept and allow that which is showing up. Because they say it takes about 90 seconds for an emotion to run its course through the whole body. That's when you're doing it with it. But I always tell people, 90 seconds, like they're like, whoa, wait, it was 90 seconds and I'm still feeling. It's like it's just sort of a general rule of thumb, but
Yeah.
like just really be with it in its totality for a couple of minutes. Accept and allow it to just be what it is. And then P, proceed mindfully, proceed with loving kindness, with gentleness. If it's this can be used for inner dialogue stuff and stuff that's being triggered from within or outside or with another person. It's just helping us get into the practice of pause and be, right? Because that in itself are pieces of being present with what is showing up. And we're so used to reactivity. So that little acronym with SNAP, it's like this ability to help us not snap out of it like in a mean way, but it's just to help us remember there is a choice here. There is an option for me to be with all of this in a different way. And it's not going to just like be easy right away or whatever. But when you do it again and again, it starts to really just become like a second nature thing. So with all things, it's about practice. I really appreciate everything that you were able to share this far. I'm excited to just get this going. And I feel like this first one, we got some really cool stuff. I can't wait to kind of get a little more into all the other myths, down why we have such a yucky relationship, especially in the Western world, with death, and those really beautiful mystical experiences and transcendental experiences that we have with loved ones and touch a little bit more on some of those stories. And is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up this first
Well,
segment?
this is great, Janie. It's really a great opportunity. The only thing I guess I would say is that I do everything through my nonprofit now. Find me either by Googling my name or turningwithin.org. You can see that under my name there. That's my meditation website. Overcomingthefearofdeath.org is my grief and death and dying website. And I have a spiritual website that's kelvinchin.org. It kind of
Okay.
covers everything. But what I want everybody to understand is that I give a free initial phone consultation to anybody in the world. I have clients in 70 countries now. So we can just have a phone conversation, and you would go to any of those websites and you go on the contact page, and my calendar is there. And so you can just schedule a time to talk with me for free about anything that we're talking about.
I love it. Yeah, you have lots of resources, and then you even have like clips on YouTube and
Yeah,
just so
YouTube
much that,
channel.
yeah, you have your YouTube channel. So, and now we've got this series, and we're just doing whatever we can to do our part to spread awareness on, again, just compassionate curiosity. Like
Yep.
if we can all learn those two things a little bit more, it really will help with the changes that we go through in life, expected or unexpected.
Yeah.
So,
That's
thank
beautiful,
you.
Katie. Great for
Yeah.
thanks for the venue here. It's great to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to what else is to come. All
Yeah,
right. All
fun.
right. Thank
Okay.
you, everyone, for watching, and peace be in you. PazMesa.
Thank you for watching Good Grief, Meeting Loss with Presence one wave at a time. Be sure to subscribe to Rise Above TV and tune in for the next episode where we'll share more insights about grief so you can face it mindfully.